almost all of the major faith traditions have a mandate to use our God-given wisdom and abilities to make the world better for everyone, for the poor in particular, the vulnerable, the elderly and children, the sick. All of those, our traditions mandate us to provide direct care and to help create a society that ensures justice and freedom and opportunity for all of its people, a society committed to enhancing the human dignity of all people. We can't do that without a sense of prophetic witness to bring that message of morality, of justice, of equity, of compassion into the fabrics of our society, including the political policies of our society. Religion provides value added to confronting the environmental crisis that endangers the entire world. We bring several core ideas that can help shape the kind of response that is so desperately needed. First, we have a sense derived from the biblical admonition that the earth is the eternal's and the fullness thereof, that what we own in a trust relationship with God, who has given to us God's creation with the proviso that we be guardians of the earth, that we take care to tend and to till the earth, and that we share the benefits of God's creation with those of God's children who are the poor, who are the left out. Those are crucially important factors. First, the sense that there is a religious obligation to do this work. It has had the benefit of bringing certain conservative Evangelical and Pentecostal and Catholic and conservative Muslim communities into the battle to preserve God's creation, who otherwise may have sat on the sidelines and regarded this as just a liberal obligation for their fellow citizens. Secondly, the concern for the poor. We know at a global level and at a local level, it is often the poor who are left out of the steps to address environmental challenges. The poor countries of the world did the least to create the problem of global climate change. They have the least resources to mitigate the impacts, the deleterious impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, the eradication of forests in the country, the changing deforestation and the increasingly arid climates that make farming much more challenging and difficult. All of those disproportionately affect the poorer countries of the world here, and they have least resources to adapt to new technologies. So it is crucially important that any policies ensure that the poor are taken care of. Again, a message that is a particular focal point of the religious communities engaged in this issue. And finally, one of religion's greatest contributions to ethical thought in world history is a sense of an obligation to generations yet unborn, to the generations to come. And no issue it resonates so deeply with the motivation to address the challenges that we face than the environmental issue does, and the obligation we have to future generations. Human trafficking and slavery has existed from, we read of slavery in the Bible, of the Jews in Egypt, of the Israelites in Egypt. It's been a plague that has affected humanity from time immemorial. And it continues. It continues because there's so much money to be made, not just in the purchase of people, but in how those people are used. It is often coerced and enforced labor that affects so many different industries around the world. on a local level in terms of sweatshops that people are forced into out of those local communities, but people traffic for sex trafficking purposes, for labor purposes, to serve as maids in homes in rich countries with a promise of that they would be rewarded for that, and then they end up with enormous debts that they owe people, and they're trapped in this. So it is a plague around the world, and if we include in that forced marriages, we're talking about almost doubling the number of people in coerced activities that they might not otherwise be. They would not have voluntarily gone. If we include forced marriages, some 22 million women in forced marriages now, who were sold to people to marry, who were given away by parents to marry in return for money that was exchanged for them in terms of people. Think of the Yazidis who were captured by ISIS and then forced to convert and forced to marry soldiers to placate their needs here. If we include that, this is an extraordinary period. Nearly 50 million people enslaved or in coerced labor all across the globe today. So it is a crisis of the first order, and one that there has to be a partnership between the moral forces of this society, led by the religious communities and the governments of this country, to really crack down on it far more effectively than we've done. We often talk about the 3 Ps, to prevent trafficking, to protect the victims of trafficking, to prosecute the traffickers, as the core of what's happening. Our first 2, if we're going to be effective, the religious community can play a very, very important role. We can play an important role in educating our congregants in communities all across the world about the plague that trafficking is and the brutality of the impact it has on the bodies and the souls of those who are trapped in slavery. We can help educate our people what are the signs to look for of people trafficking. We can educate them in many of the countries of the automatic numbers to call, the 800 numbers, the free phone numbers that they can call to report what looks like a trafficking situation, and where the police are trained to respond to those calls immediately to try to check out what the situation is. We can help them educate people in their own families who may be subject to conditions that lead to trafficking, and warn them of what might happen, of what to do if somebody tries to coerce them or to trick them into, through deceit and false promises, into opportunities that are very different from the experience that they're going to face. Secondly, we can set up programs that when victims find their way out, are either escaped or rescued, that there are communities there to welcome them and to provide for them, to help them with housing, to help them with a support network, to help them find health needs provided for, etc. Many of our congregations do that. Many of the Catholic orders, particularly the women's orders, are deeply engaged in working to support victims of trafficking. So all across the world, if we address these issues, it really can make a difference. And pause for a minute here, because I want to add one thing to the environment. One other piece of the religious community's environment, just think about this. There are well over 10 million houses of worship, religious hospitals, religious schools, all across the globe. Way over 10 million of them. Imagine if every one of them adopted sustainable energy policies, recycled their goods, purchased recycled goods, planted trees, educated their members what they could do to be responsible in terms of protecting the environment, mobilize their billions of adherents to speak out on these issues and demand that their governments engage in policies aimed at protecting God's creation. What an enormous impact that could have. The religious communities of the world could help transform this effort to protect God's creation. It's in our hands. When we talk about all of the problems that we face, debt relief and how it devastates the stability in developing countries that are shackled by that, left without the resources to provide for the core needs of their people. When we look at the devastation that climate change is wreaking on areas of the world today, when we look at the strife that is going on in many localities across the globe, from Sudan to Gaza to Myanmar to many other areas where people are victimized by violence in our countries, we see the largest number of migrants and refugees in the history of the world. When people are forced into those positions, they become very keen targets for the traffickers to pick them up in terms of either slave trafficking in the sex industries or forced labor in mines, in factories, and elsewhere. So these things really are all tied together. And the religious communities, many of us are involved in different pieces of this. One of the good things about this kind of conference is that it brings together the people who really are knowledgeable champions of different segments of protecting the vulnerable, ensuring that no one will be left behind, to find ways for us to work together to magnify and multiply the impact that we can have on entities like the G20 and the G7, on the World Economic Forum, in terms of the impact we can have on businesses and in every local community across the globe. This kind of conference is an enormous stimulus to people to be courageous and bold in going ahead, knowing that together we can do things that none of us can do alone.